good morning all, and thank you very much for joining. So my name is Richard McLean. I'm the Chief Markets Officer at BCIS. Today we're going to be looking at asking the experts around combining cost and carbon. So we're expecting the webinar going to last approximately around 45 minutes. We have got a lot of questions to go through, so we may spill over if we've got time at the end for a few more. So this is our very first carbon panel webinar that we've delivered as BCIS. Very much internal view at the moment. We're hoping the next stage after this is we're going to use some practitioners from the market who have already got experience in cost and carbon and really get an understanding of their journey and what they've been doing so far. So we'll pick up some more details of those in the future. I'll briefly be doing some introductions to today's panel and who we've got speaking, and then I'm going to quickly go through just a bit about the industry itself and really where we are with regards to sustainability and embodied carbon. So without further ado, if we pop over now, you'll see there's a taskbar on the menu screen in front of you at the moment. Now, what that is there, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask us, they are ready. They're all anonymous as well. So we're very much aware that people are at different stages of their career at the moment. Some people might not have any experience with carbon. Some will be more experienced. So please feel completely safe to ask any question on here. We probably won't be able to attend to most of them today. From our previous webinar, we had 600 attendees and 200 questions. We've kind of gathered them together today to try and get some of the major themes and topics that we're picking up from the market. However, we will be answering all questions asked. We'll circulate these to everyone who's attending today, and also a recording of the session itself. So you'll also see some poll questions popping up throughout the session. So they'll come every kind of 7 or 8 minutes. And really what we're trying to get a real understanding of is just where everyone is in terms of where your experience is with carbon at the moment. So we've got a better understanding and see where you see your role in the industry itself. Also, to be completely open, it also helps us really drive relevant content for these webinars that we continue for the industry. So yeah, any suggested topics, any hot areas, please let us know and we'll be happy to consider them. And just final bit of housekeeping from me is we will be sending a feedback survey at the end of this. So you'll shortly receive that after the session. If we could just ask if you could please take the time to complete it for us. All of the feedback really does help us. So without further ado, I will introduce you to our panel today. So first of all, we have James Fisk, so the CEO of BCIS and the founder and chair of the Built Environment Carbon Database. So good morning, James.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, Rich.
And alongside James, we've also got Carl Horton, who is our Chief Data Officer here at BCIS. So good morning, Carl.
Good morning, everyone.
And as we said, we do advertise both of these as experts in cost and carbon. So please don't hesitate on the most difficult questions you can possibly think of. We absolutely guarantee that we will answer them. Okay. Gents?
Thank you for that, Rich. Yeah, very much appreciated. Yeah, all the tricky questions will be going over to Carl.
Brilliant. And just before we get on to the core topic as well, just a bit of shameless publicity for ourselves. But yeah, hopefully most of you have seen that BCIS won in the Engineering Matters Award as a net zero champion. So we actually received the gold award at the Engineering Matters. So really great achievement for us. We're very, very happy. And if you see the handsome people on the photo next to myself and James, you'll spot me. As well.
Just to be clear, I wasn't invited, everyone, just to be clear.
and bearing a grudge by the sound of things, Carl.
So great. Before we pop onto the questions, just wanted to really set the scene for everyone's benefit, really. So we've seen the interest in carbon reporting for quite some time in the industry. Our view of the market really is this has accelerated quite significantly in the last 6 months. So there is a need to understand the combination of cost and carbon, and we're seeing that more within our core market. So the more of the QS practitioners we're working with a lot of the consultancies, it seems to be becoming a prominent issue. Now, we're kind of famous for the line, but 40% of greenhouse emissions do come purely from the built environment. And a recent study has found a significant increase in the number of contractors reporting that they are now being asked to provide carbon assessments on schemes. So up from 14% last year to 33%. So it's a really significant increase in this demand for live carbon assessments on schemes. And the global construction market is also predicted to grow by 42% by 2030. So we really can't ignore those numbers. So all seen in the news, the implications of carbon emissions that we have on our planet, in our lives, and in the lives of others. So it's now about what can we do to mitigate that impact. We're in an incredibly important marketplace to really make a difference. But obviously, if we don't make a difference, we can make a worse impact into the market. So our focus as BCIS is very much to support the professionals across the industry, regardless of their role, in the decarbonisation of the built environment. We need everyone to be playing their part in this, and we see the ambition as everyone's responsibility within the sector. So here to equip professionals with our data and to support that. So this is ideally part of the webinar series, and we'll also talk about some of the product offering that we've got available to really tackle these issues. So we're hoping to allow you to make more informed choices to reduce the amount of carbon in your specification choices or in your project decisions. So in order to achieve all of this, those in the industry need standards. So tell us how and what to measure. Very much that we're used to in the cost already, and carbon is very much replicating that at the minute. So once we can measure it appropriately and consistently, then only we can reduce it. So let's get into some questions, if our panel is ready and armed for us.
Yeah, I think, Rich, before we jump into the questions, just to reiterate some of the key points there, that we are in a climate emergency. We are starting to see those impacts, and just to underline that, everybody needs to be doing something about this, not just from a professional perspective, but from a home life perspective as well. Doing everything that we can to reduce emissions is absolutely super critical. There are a number of challenges associated with trying to do stuff, and hopefully we'll get some questions along these lines. But having a consistent methodology, applying that methodology, having consistent data is absolutely critical to being able to measure and reduce, as you rightly said. But there are some fundamental issues around all of those things that we really need to, as an industry, be coming together to try and address them. So depending on what kind of horrible questions you've got lined up for us, Rich, and I'm sure you have, knowing you, we'll probably expand on some of those themes. But yeah, just to underline that this is our chance to hopefully have a positive impact and reduce the emissions on the planet. And any question that anybody wants to ask is fine, even if it's really easy. Really simple questions, absolutely are the ones that we should. Absolutely right. Yeah, we've done lots of previous topics on and webinars on this, where we've tried to demystify some of the terminology, but even now I'm involved in lots of discussions across the industry, and we are still getting things like basic terminology wrong, or we are interpreting those things differently. So please feel free to ask anything to us today. Sorry, Rich. Yeah, carry on.
No, good. No, absolutely. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so we've gathered kind of majorly between sort of 8 key questions that we've got, and as I said, we're going to start picking them out from the chat after that if we've got time. As I said, we're trying to aim to wrap up within 45 minutes, and we're probably going to leak over with a few, but yeah, just to reassure you, if your question doesn't get answered in the session, we will come back to you. So we'll start with the first question, which is a rebuild versus retrofit. So it seems to be getting traction through in terms of regulation at the moment. It depends where projects are based. How important do you think a move towards retrofit is to help reduce emissions? And how easy is it to use cost and carbon data to work out the optimum is for retaining existing materials or part of the structure? And if you don't mind including as well, what changes do we need to see in a planning system to make those decisions easier?
And that's your opening question. Whoa.
Thank you, Evan.
I was going to do one on football, but we'll stick with it.
Right, let's try and break that down into chunks, Rich, for my simple head. So there was a bit around retrofit versus new build. I think let's focus on that bit first. So retrofit versus, yeah, obviously there's some pretty high profile cases out there at the moment, isn't there? Which predominantly, I guess, is built into that question. Retrofit versus new build is quite a passionate topic around the industry for obvious reasons. We can't turn around on this call and say, yeah, it should all be retrofit or it should all be new build, because the cases are very individual based on the needs of the building, what the building is at the moment, and all sorts of bits. I think what we should probably talk about on this panel is we need to appraise options consistently across the whole life of the asset. So by that I mean it's not just the initial work involved in either retrofitting or refurbing an existing building or building a new one. It's all of the ongoing operational emissions. It's every time you maintain, it's every time you replace a component within a building. All of those things need to be understood and quantified consistently, being one of the bits that we will come on to, I'm sure, during today's sort of session. They need to be appraised consistently using a consistent methodology and a consistent piece of data, because it's very easy to skew the results to make it fit what the story you're trying to portray is. So if we use sort of a live example of if Carl, I'll pick on you. Carl, you're building a new build office, and I'm refurbishing a 1950s office. For the retrofit, obviously we can't appraise the carbon associated with what was in my 1950s office, because we don't know in reality what the emissions were involved in all of the materials building that thing in the 1950s. So we have to appraise the option from this point going forwards. So that means all of the stripping out of the stuff that we need to do and all of the new stuff that we want to put in to try and improve things like the thermal efficiency of the building, and making sure it obviously works in terms of what we need that space to be. Carl's new build office, obviously he'll be able to build that from scratch to the requirements that he needs. He'll build it with super insulation. He'll build it with the latest sort of technologies. So ultimately, Carl's building is likely to use more materials and more carbon up front because he's building that building for the first time. But there's lots of stuff involved in my retrofit that to try and improve things like the thermal efficiency of it. So I'll be putting in more insulation. I'll be retrofitting, heat sources and other bits. So all of those things become quite complicated, and they are very much on a case-by-case basis. So having the ability to sort of appraise those options and quantify those things consistently with consistent data is the only way that we can actually get to an answer, in my opinion. Carl, I don't know if you agree or disagree with what I've just said there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the foundations of what you're talking about there are correct. Consistency has to be clear. We have to be measuring and comparing options on a like-for-like basis. For me personally, I don't think we should get into a world where we should be able to just knock something down and rebuild it, and that's a better outcome than what retrofit is. If I'm speaking again personally from a UK perspective, I think we have a lot of heritage in a lot of sort of amazing buildings in the UK that should be conserved as best we can, and I would prefer to see them sort of retrofit as opposed to being knocked down and rebuilt just because it ticks a box on a sort of carbon agenda. But I think for me, it's also just about it's getting the balance right, because it's making sure that we can fit buildings to eventually, you know, have the minimum optimal minimal impact on the environment, which is what we're trying to do. So yeah, I completely agree. It's about getting the balance, but it's also about when we're making those decisions, it's having the right evidence and information supporting that.
I think there's a bit of a risk there, isn't there? Because we know, Carl, historically from various discussions and projects, that there has been a bit more of a stronger focus on the operational, reducing the operational energy and therefore obviously the operational carbon of buildings. And if you do, if you are just looking at that, there is a real risk that you're going to come up with the wrong conclusions there, aren't there? You know, knock down, rebuild, because ultimately I can build something that's you know, thermally more efficient and therefore using less sort of energy sort of going forwards. So again, I think, yeah, making sure that we're looking at the whole life, not just focusing on that operational aspect is really important.
Yeah, and that, you know, again, looking at the operationals, it's looking at, you know, what is the ownership period likely to be? What is the operating part of it? And what's the life expectancy of those assets that you've got are looking to put in, and what's the usage profile of those when they're in place? So all those things need to be taken into account when you come up with those decisions.
That's also a bit of a challenge for us. Sorry, Rich, I'm going to ask Carl some questions as well. I hope you
It
don't
feels
mind.
like I'm on the panel.
I'll leave you to it.
Thank you. That's incredibly kind. Yeah. So you touched upon sort of, you know, how long people are involved, and I think that's also another challenge that we have. If you think of the old traditional developer that's building and passing something on, their viewpoint is often around obviously the here and now, so the upfront cost and the upfront carbon values, and making it obviously look as attractive as possible for a future sort of purchaser. Likewise, if you're a tenant within a section of a building, you know, perhaps you're looking at that. You know, I'm going to be here for the next sort of 5 years. How do we get round that, Carl, do you think, in the industry? Very similar to the politicians being in power for 4 or 5 years and just focusing on those 4 or 5 years, isn't it? It's a similar kind of mindset shift that I think we need to try and get in the industry. It's a tricky question for you, Carl.
It's a tricky question, yeah. I think, yeah, so the ownership model for owning a building, I'm going to think off the top of my head in some respects, but if you think about an occupier is going to take an asset for say 30 years, you would hope over the legacy that they want to leave behind on that footprint of that building is going to be one that can be extended to, you know, and can be owned by someone else and have the same kind of level of, hopefully, the experience in terms of what they've done to reduce carbon footprint. That will be continued, and they'll be looking to have a facility that's handed over with no kind of, if you can imagine in this sort of PFI world, when you're handing back sort of schools, etc., that you've got assets in there, you're going to sort of make a trade-off and say, well, we don't want to have the old sort of fuel combustion sort of boilers, etc. We want to have, you know, electric sort of generated ones instead of air source heat pumps. We want these sorts of things, and it's about making that trade-off and being able to have that conversation where you know, it's more of a pragmatic one about actually the wider benefits of saying if we know it's not necessarily a like for like what we'll hand it back to you, but actually the gains you're going to get from a longer term environmental impact are beneficial to do this. So I think it's just being able to have some evidence to back up the sort of statements you're making and saying, actually, if we do this way, you know, the cost impact is this, but actually the longer term carbon impact is this. So I think it's just having the information available to allow you to have those conversations. And it might come down to, if you think about in the financial world, you know, if you've got financial records, you have to hold them for a certain point, and you know, almost accountable in some respects. And it's a little bit like that, you know, it's almost like, what's the incentivization of making sure I hand back an asset or have an asset that is optimum beyond my ownership? And Matt, perhaps that's the space to move into or look at.
Yeah, there's a whole topic of another webinar there, Rich, I think, in terms of how we could address that. There was initiatives around building passports and all sorts of things, Carl, that we probably need to catch up with the industry and find out what's happening with those things as well. So, yeah, sorry, Rich, carry on. I'll shut up.
So I'm not sure of that question. I'm not sure of that question. How much have we've dealt with and how much we haven't?
Oh, yeah,
well, we tried to wait 5 minutes for each answer, gents, and we failed miserably. So we'll move on to the next one anyway. Great. Okay. So the second question is: so although some clients are interested in exploring lower carbon alternatives in the design phase, their attention is more on reducing operational. So I think we've probably covered operational versus CapEx now. So I think we've covered quite well on that. So the only part I would say just from question 1 was just regarding changes in the planning system required. Is there anything more we'd want to just consider regarding that topic?
Absolutely. I think we've been very vocal about this type of thing in the past, that yeah, some planning departments are slightly ahead of others in terms of asking for whole life carbon assessments and things, Rich, as part of any application. And absolutely, that's what we need to be doing. But the slight challenge that we have in the industry is that until we've got that, the methodology that's been adopted into software tools that people are being using, that are armed with and fueled by that consistent, trusted sort of data, the danger is that any applications that are going over to planning departments could obviously be skewed. So there's a bit of work that we need to do in the industry there to make sure that software tools are stamped as being compliant with the RICS methodology, and that the data meets that level of rigor. Really, there is going to be a trend, and we've talked about this previously, I think, on a webinar, that in the future we're likely to see more audits on some of the things like the carbon numbers and the green numbers that are coming out of assessments. Some projects are being based on, and financed based on their green sort of credentials, and there's obviously a real risk that if we haven't applied the rigor to those calculations or that underlying data source in terms of any assessment, that we're not going to be standing up to that level of sort of audit very favourably, Rich. So I think there's an element of planning do need to change. Planning and probably government are slightly reluctant, because this also sort of feeds into the mandate of why aren't we mandating carbon assessments on all buildings. And part of that is making sure that we do have all of the bits of the jigsaw that need to be applied consistently, without adding so much of a burden onto the supply chain that are already struggling to keep their heads above water in certain areas. So planning do need to change, but we as an industry need to also sort of help them by applying that level of consistency in these assessments, I think, is what I'm trying to say very badly.
No, well, good, thank you. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
I just add very, very quickly on the from my observations on the planning world. I think you're absolutely right, James, in terms of the industry needs to do more, and I think planning in particular needs to have consistency across the whole of the UK. I think there's still, even in general design, there's still it can depend on the planning department you've got, how what their mood is like on a particular day, and it does come down to some of those behavioral things. So as well as as those factors that come into it, we also want to make sure that we arm them with as much evidence to say this is why we should be doing these installation of this type. This is why this fabric needs to be like this, because of the long-term benefits that we'll get from the environment. So I think there's the planning departments need to be armed with as much information as possible to support that, but be willing to accept those and embrace that.
Yeah.
Great. No, lovely. Thank you, Carl. Okay, so I've grouped the next two questions together. So sorry, they're slightly wordy, but I'll try and do them as slowly as possible. question number 3 was, it's not really possible to work with EPDs when there's been no specification. So even if we use EPDs in the design phase, the coverage is so hit and miss on the details of them, they are not really comparable. So, and also there's a question here about how meaningful they are. So what would the best practice be for estimating carbon in the early estimating stages? And the second part of that question is also, is it okay to use product averages in early stage modeling as better than using nothing at all?
I think the second question almost answers the first. That's quite handy. Yeah, I think of carbon estimating the same way as we do cost estimating. So, you know, if you're a detailed design stage and the design teams have specified particular manufacturers or particular performance specifications on components, then, you know, at that detailed design stage, you can be pretty clear in terms of, you know, what the cost or the carbon value of those things are. But if you step back to earlier design stages where we're not quite sure of those things, absolutely you have to use ranges. So yeah, things like materials, when you're just turning around and saying, well, I need a material to do this, but I'm not quite sure what that is yet, then clearly, you know, we need to sort of estimate using those ranges. So you either deal with it as a range in terms of sort of a point estimate in terms of the cost and the carbon value, or you deal with it with uncertainty factors and contingencies. So sort of different ways that you can sort of deal with that. Carl, it might be useful to talk through. Obviously, BCIS produced the cost and carbon materials database, which at the moment is linking to a single sort of EPD with a conversion. It's probably worthwhile explaining to people what we're intending to do with that, because that links into that sort of range sort of point question. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Just before we do that, I think it's an interesting, your first take on that very question was around, and you came at that from a costing background, a QS sort of fraternity, and it's very interesting to I guess understand who would be, if it was an engineer type person, an architect, what their mindset would be in terms of that. So very interesting that you went straight down the cost estimating road, and we probably, you were alluding to an uncertainty funnel or costing certainty funnel, probably very similar with carbon in terms of, you know, it's depending on how far you are along your design stage, it's a very similar thing for carbon. But yeah, you're absolutely right. For what we've been doing in terms of our cost and carbon database for materials, you know, we've been on a journey of discovery on the EPDs and the quality of those EPDs, and you know, what we've been trying to do through the advent of BECD is to extract and have a place to utilize those EPDs for all the different products that are out there, and trying to bring them in. And there are such different qualities, such different levels of maturity, and we've had the painstaking task of trying to take them and convert them in from what is a product measure unit into something that can be a unit of measure in terms of a construction activity or material. And what we've been doing is to try wherever possible to obviously come up with, at the moment there is a single number that is relatively aligned to sort of I guess particular product in one instance. But what we want to do as we get more and more information through is to build that from one single number to product ranges, so you can start to understand, you know, what are the upper and lower limits of a particular product that you're putting in. And that's very much the journey that we're on at the moment. As more and more EPDs become available, you know, we are capturing as much information as possible about those to enhance what we have as within certain product offerings that we've got. But I think it's a little bit like cost benchmarking. The more data you can get in, the more you're able to verify that and validate that, to actually say, actually that number feels a lot more appropriate.
Great, lovely. Thank you, Carl. So next question. So you previously mentioned a mandate, James. I think this is probably aimed towards you, I think, but you previously mentioned a mandate is needed to reduce emissions. How prepared do you think the industry is for this? different firms to be approaching different calculations, reporting in different ways, lots of developing their own calculations, so potentially making the picture even more confusing. So how can we get everyone to work in the same way?
Yeah, okay. This is a very passionate topic of mine. It probably is aimed at me. I've obviously been quite vocal about some of these issues. So I think we've touched earlier upon the is the industry ready for this? I think we're a lot closer than where we were, but I think there's some fundamental things that need to be addressed. So if we think of the constituent parts on and I think we've presented this as a slide on a previous webinar, what bits need to be in place in terms of our jigsaw? We've got the methodology. Well, we got the methodology from the RICS. That's out there. New version has come out recently. It's a lot more complicated. So I'll pick my words carefully here. We've improved the quality of the standard from an RICS perspective. My concern around that standard at the moment is that it's so complicated that we've probably removed its accessibility into the wider professionals in the way that I think we need this thing. So I know RICS are working on sort of simplified versions and training courses and all sorts of other things, but there is still some work that I think we need to do in terms of the standard. So you've got the methodology, you then got software tools. We've got lots of software tools, lots of free calculators, lots of commercial calculators out there in the industry, claiming to be compliant with the RICS standard, and others not claiming to be compliant. They're all coming out with different numbers. They're all using different data, and I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong, but fundamentally we're developing a problem for ourselves in the industry by not sort of making sure we've got consistency in terms of the application, the calculation, if you like, of those numbers. So software, we need to do something to make sure that software and any calculators are fully compliant. Then we've got the data part of the jigsaw, which obviously we're very passionate about at BCIS as well. Having a consistent set of data with things like what Carl was talking about there, the BCIS cost and carbon database, consistently giving cost and carbon values at various stages of design. We need to have that in place. We need that 100% used consistently in the industry. And then last but not least, we need to make sure that we've got competent people running these assessments. So we've got training courses and various things that I alluded to before, but we need to make sure that, well, quite frankly, anybody who's on this call and wider in the industry can pick up and do this type of thing. And there's still work that we need to do there. I think we asked a poll, Rich, you'll remember this better than me, in our, I think it was our last sort of carbon related webinar, where we asked if people were feeling adequately prepared to be able to do it, and the number was quite low. Lots of people feeling that they want to do something and they currently don't feel equipped or ready to be able to do it. So harshly speaking, in terms of our very simple 4-piece jigsaw, we've got work to do on most of those areas, I think, before we can realistically, ask or expect government to be rolling out mandates. So there's work that we need to do on all of those bits, I'm afraid. So that was the first part of the question. I've forgotten any other parts that you've asked me, because I was so focused, Rich, on not losing the plot and raging and jumping on my soapbox as I normally do with that. So hopefully I kept my cool quite well.
No, well done. Yeah. No, I think you've covered most of it. Obviously, the first was about how prepared is the industry. I think that's covered. Approaching calculations, reporting in different ways. I think that's covered. No, I think we've. I think the final is how can we get everyone to work in the same way? Is probably the fundamental part of that question, I would say. Yeah,
and this bit's obviously more of a challenge. I'm not saying one piece of software should rule them all. There is a need for different pieces of software to support various different tasks that are being done within the industry. We just need to make sure that those things are fully compliant. They are using the same data and the same methodology. BCIS have been working on something called Lifecycle Evaluator, which is basically a whole life cost and whole life carbon calculation and reporting system that does generate reports in compliance with cost standards, so NRM1 and NRM3 for those quantity surveyors on the call, but also whole life carbon assessments as well. That utilizes the materials cost and carbon databases and some of the other data that we've got within BCIS on life cycle costing, and combines that into a system that we hope is going to be a bit of a game changer for, in particular, quantity surveyors that we think are very well placed to being able to do carbon measurement. Rich, that's probably a whole new topic of another webinar, but quantity surveyors are trained to measure things, and they should be utilizing those skills not just for cost analysis, but also carbon reporting. So a lot of the tools that we're producing in the data sources are aligning cost and carbon, because quantity surveyors are very well placed at being able to do this, but also B, that it fundamentally addresses the common question, which is, well, how much more am I going to have to pay for low carbon options? You know, what's the difference between this option and this option? I'm only interested in the upfront cost, or actually, if I go for that cheaper material upfront because it's a lower cost initially, how many times am I going to have to replace that thing over its life, and therefore the cost and the carbon value is much higher over its life? They're the common questions that I imagine most surveyors and quantity surveyors, and maybe likely to be engineers and others, will be asked. So we're trying to design data and tools to support those things, Rich, that I'm sure Carl will talk about a little in a little bit more detail later on. But yeah, making sure calculations are consistent data, regardless of what software solution is being used, is absolutely critical to getting this rolled out.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you. So I think we probably covered some of the topic around here, but the next question was around the traditional CapEx, OpEx challenge and how carbon is added onto that. So the question of GHG's carbon is tied up with a budget, and there's not really or very little profit in projects as it is. So as we see business failures in the supply chain, it's harder to then talk about paying even more for low carbon intensive materials. So if clients are being forced to incorporate these, how can we get them to think about how it might be better on the long run?
Good question. So I think we've touched upon that in a few of our answers here. That first of all, there's an assumption in that question that lower carbon solutions are more expensive, which I would absolutely question. One of the best ways of reducing carbon on a construction project is to use less materials, basically. so there is an absolute link between cost and carbon reduction. We've sort of touched upon this, and Carl jump in here, but the whole life approach is I think the best way of sort of explaining it. So if you let's go for the scenario of Mrs. Fisk wants a very nice tiled floor in the entrance of Fisk Towers, and Mr. Fisk, who's a middle-aged grumpy quantity surveyor, wants carpet. He wants carpet because it's cheaper to install up front, because he's tight, and Mrs. Fisk wants the grand sort of tiles. Now, looking at those initially, carpet cheaper, tiles more expensive. But actually, if we look that, man, we're going to stay here for the next 20-30 years. My carpet I'm going to be replacing every 5 years. The tiles we don't have to replace, we just have to do a little bit of maintenance on. So in the debate where Mrs. Fisk wins the argument, as she ultimately always does, tiles would be the lower cost option over the life. So again, it's back to that sort of appraising options over the life, not just looking at the here and now, and not just looking at cost, but also looking at the carbon values, which I think is the answer. Carl, jump in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and good example, I'd say. But I think, yeah, and again, also it's like at the end of it, it's in likelihood that carpet won't be able to be recycled in terms of the, it won't be able to be repurposed necessarily. It will just go off to landfill in the main. Whereas in some respects, the tiles, unless they're damaged, can probably be used and recycled elsewhere. So there's an element to that as well, what happens afterwards. So obviously that's a key part of any of this sort of, what happens at the end of life. So it's not just that initial kind of capital cost, it's not even the operational, it's the whole life of it, and it's what happens afterwards. And all those considerations need to be taken into account. I'm again a bit like you, James, when it comes to it's been the mindset of many, and still is when it comes to decision makers, that they look at the capital cost and the capital carbon, and it's such a bigger debate than that. And it's about having the right people around the table when you're making those decisions, but also having the data that supports it.
Carl, I wonder if it's worth just flashing up life cycle evaluator briefly that sort of shows this cost and carbon over time type. That might help distill what we're trying to say graphically better than my example of tiles versus carpet.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, gents. Actually, a lot of the questions we're getting in, I think we could probably answer with just quickly showing what this actually looks like. Yeah, a lot of questions around this topic at the moment.
Okay.
Let me try and share my screen. So that'll be the first asset test. Do I become the presenter, Rich? Is that the way I operate on this?
You should be already, I believe.
Okay, so if I flip to here, can people see this?
Not yet.
Okay.
Can't see anything yet, Carl. You can tell this is live and raw.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Right, let's let me know where you can see this. Hopefully, come through. No, it's not, for some reason it's not letting me share. Just change. Just try again.
Great. Yeah, you're showing now, Carl.
Excellent. Great. So as James has alluded to, we've got a new product which has launched recently, Lifecycle Evaluator, and what we're trying to do with this particular product is to have an environment where we've got cost and carbon being measured exactly the same time in a consistent fashion. So as we've talked about before, we're having the linkage between the materials, and they've been assessed, and the same quantification and measure has been done for both cost and carbon. So what we've got within our tool here, and it's meant to be designed to be a light touch kind of estimating tool, is to have that kind of ability to do those kind of modeling that we've been talking about. So in this example here, you can start to put in here your kind of, what's your reference study period. So this is that, how long are you going to own and operate this facility for? And obviously typically for a building, it's 60 years. Infrastructure is more like 120 years, but you get to put in here how long you're going to have that particular asset. You can talk about the usage profile. So we've modeled it so that if it's the typical usage profile, so if you took a hotel as an example, you might have certain areas that are going to be more kind of like the concourse area, the reception area is going to be more sort of walked through than it is in particular sort of corridors, etc. So we've modeled different profiles in terms of usage, again, just to give an idea of what impacts that has. So within this tool, I'll just click on a couple of things. So by having the parameters around the duration, that gives us the ability to not only just model the actual capital costs, but also give us the ability to go into the actual operational side of it. So what does that look like in terms of, so you would normally go through and pick your different components, etc. But I'm just going to quickly just jump to sort of results to give you a quick illustration of the sort of things you'll be looking to see. So from a summary at construction phase, so we're talking about construction only here, you start to get a picture on a cost footprint and a carbon footprint of a facility. And you can start to see where your big ticket items are, as you would classically do as quantity surveyors in the main. You have an appreciation of where your costs are going for your facility build-up. But at the same time, you get to understand also from a carbon footprint as well. Not on there, say it's where, you know, which element of the carbon effects are coming through. But also sort of building on that as well, you get to have a picture, again, just thinking about the initial capital part, of what are the top materials that are impacting your carbon, and what are what do they look like in terms of the elements. So you start to have an appreciation straight away where your hotspots are in regard to different elements of the facility. And it's at that point there you can then start to say, do you know what, actually, what about if I took out a load of concrete work or a load of steel work and actually replace that with, say, timber, which we know has a lower carbon footprint, or even negative in some respects. So you can quickly optioneer and start to make decisions very, very quickly about what products and materials you're putting into an asset, and give the relevant impacts. But that gives you a kind of very much the front end. But going back to what James's point was around the operation side of it. So I click on this tab here, you'll start to see that, again, these charts have changed, the dynamics changed, because we're looking now at modeling it over the 60 years, so that the numbers have changed, the significance has changed, but also we start to see on our charts, where are the spikes, or when are we seeing within our 60 years, when are the big hits going to come in terms of the carbon, the item or the asset replacement. Which years am I going to have to spend, or I need to be aware of that an asset is going to be coming up to being replaced. So we're able to model that, and again, that gives you the evidence to allow you to sort of, you know, make those decisions about from an operational phase over just the construction. We've got various different formats of how you can show that sort of data. James, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add on that on the graphics.
No, I think it's identifying every single, you know, carbon total or cost total for the components that you've used. Now, obviously, we haven't got time to show this in any detail whatsoever. But the idea is that what underpins all of this information are components. So you set up a project, you add your components. Those components are built up by BCIS in a way that it identifies every activity that's undertaken on a component. So an activity would be installing it for the first time, or a planned maintenance activity, or a replacement activity when that component wears out and you need to replace it. They're all activities that these components have. Those activities are all built up from labour, materials and plant. And you have the ability within a tool like this to go, okay, well, I don't want to use that material. I want to use an entirely different material. And then you go straight to these outputs and see what either the capital cost or the carbon value or the life cycle cost or the whole life carbon value, and how it changes. So this tool is being designed to allow that optioneering, what happens if, what does it mean if we do this, that sort of value engineering type activity that we would normally do on a construction project. It's probably just worth noting, Carl, that that's just the summary report. There's also fully, sort of detailed RICS carbon reports and NRM1 reports and NRM3 reports that will come out in sort of Excel and various other bits. But now is not the time to do a demo. But yeah, there's hopefully some really useful features here for design teams to sit around and go, okay, well, as you've said, Carl, what's the highest carbon material in here? What happens if we change it? What's the biggest element that we should be focusing on as a design team in order to reduce sort of cost and carbon values? And with these types of charts, you can click on it. There's a filter, Carl, isn't there? You know, show me the top 10 by carbon, high to low, and actually now I want to see cost, low to high, and you know, all of those things obviously dynamically built. So what
James, sorry, just have one question because it's just popped up and I thought it was quite fitting while we're on here as well. But the question was, does the life cycle evaluator consider upfront emissions only, or is it whole life?
It's whole life. So there's 3 tabs. Carl, if you scroll to the top, we've got a construction tab, which is the initial construction. There's an operation, which is all of the maintenance and replacements and energy and everything else that you're using over the life. And then you've got a whole life tab, which combines the construction and the operation together, i.e. the whole life. You can model facilities management and all sorts of other bits in there if you want to as well in the project sort of ancillary stage that we won't go into now. So yeah, this is a whole life, but you can just use it for initial upfront capital sort of works as well. Rich.
Excellent, thank you.
So yeah, the reason we wanted to show that was more around the how do we answer the questions that we have to answer from a construction professional sort of perspective. How do we encourage people to be able to you know, think about carbon that may not be used to working with carbon, or you know, or even truly understand it yet? And the only way to really answer that is to use, you know, a compliant system with absolutely you know, quality, consistent data underneath it in order to sort of generate reports and play those tunes that we were talking about there. What happens if we change for this material? Well, actually, it's not going to cost you any more money, but look at the benefits over the life. Yeah, even for those sort of, you know, people that are only involved in the upfront construction works, there's always, you know, very compelling stories on why we should be reducing emissions, regardless of whether we should be doing it ethically or not. You know, a greener building is a more attractive building. They're you know, they're likely to be getting more premiums for those types of buildings, especially if you can generate a fully compliant report as part of the project to show future users of that building how great it is, you know. So yeah, so that was the reason that we wanted to show it, Rich. Hopefully that worked. But
yeah, absolutely, I've worked at my end. Thanks for that. I think it's probably answered a lot of the questions we've had for you in the last kind of 20 minutes. I think we're probably out of time. We're only 10 minutes over, gents, so that's not too bad for a live show, I don't think.
That time was me trying to work the screen.
Could have got a few more questions in. So yeah, just look, thank you everyone for joining so far. We've had an awful lot of questions. So just for everyone's benefit, we will be sharing the recording of this session. We will also be answering all the questions that you've asked in the session as well. They're still coming in, but you know, this doesn't mean the communication's closed. Please carry on contacting us. We're more than happy to support with questions. It's a moving feast every day, so you know, just keep in contact. We're here hopefully to help you. Great. I think from myself and the panel, just wanted to say thank you all again for taking the time, and yeah, hopefully speak to you all soon.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.